Hello, everyone, and welcome to Module 3, Learning and Teaching Theories, HRD 659. Before we begin into our deep dive into some of the theorists and ideas that we've previously looked at in this class, I want to invite you to visit our previous sessions for any introductory information or refreshers that you might need for the I guess, theorists and ideas that are presented in this slide and in the following slide. We've talked about these individuals and concepts before, and for this module, we're probably going to look at them in a more deep dive type scenario. So again, I just wanted to make a list of some of the repeated concepts and people that we're going to be looking at this week. And again, invite you to refer to the previous sessions for any introductory information you might need. So let's get started. Learning theory, cognitive learning theory. So just some basic concepts about how we learn through cognition and intuition and processing information. Just some basic concepts. This is taken from our PowerPoint slides from our textbook. Some of these are familiar to you, so I'm just going to go through them very briefly. Problems should be structured and presented so that the learner understands the background with the problems or information you're presenting him or her, and allows them to look into these problems or situations or case scenarios that you as an instructor are presenting the learner with, so that they will be able to inspect it and analyze it from their particular perspectives. The knowledge should be organized so that it's not a concern of the learner to have to categorize and compartmentalize the information. The instructor should be able to plan accordingly so that the information is delivered in a logical or chronological, whatever the subject matter or the topic might be, and have an organizational pattern that seems like a normal flowing way of understanding, and then being able to examine the information. Presenting the information culturally relative is very important. We've talked about inclusive learning environments, taking into consideration people's backgrounds, religious backgrounds, sexual orientation, gender, age, religious preference. So all of these things, when you're structuring a lecture, it's important to take into consideration and be sensitive to learners' backgrounds and their where they're coming from as individuals. And it's always important to give feedback. I think that's something that we all do presently in this course. Some of us are trainers, some of us are instructors, and it's something that we always need to keep doing, even throughout, when an assignment is done and a student, is completed, and you might want to give feedback as to, how they can relate the information to future projects, or, connect it with things that they have done in the past, but also giving them feedback, not only, being critical, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but being critical about the work that they've submitted, but also giving them feedback on how they can apply the information in the future. And of course, your goals are important. Some of us write, course objectives or learning goals. So you always want to have a clear, blueprint as to what the learner will take out of the lesson once he or she begins acquiring the information. Some of the information on this slide might be familiar to you. We've looked at Thorndike and connectivism, the law of effect, the law of readiness, learning as a result of those associations or relationships between stimuli and responses, and of course, he calls them habits. In general, connectionism suggests that the transfer of learning depends on the presence of identical elements in the original and new learning situation. So being able to relate to a previous idea or previous theorist or previous concept in order to understand the new concept and the new information being delivered is extremely important. The concept of belongingness. is also introduced in connectionism. And it states that connections are more readily established if the person perceives that stimuli or response that they go together, so that they're, bigger, a smaller part of a bigger whole. And which takes us to, some of these laws that Thorndike proposed. Law of effect, basically our response to a situation and how we are rewarded or critiqued after that situation. Are we going to encourage the behavior, or are we going to keep making the same, make the same decision? For example, positive reinforcements versus changing, how we behave or how we interpret something based on our feedback. Again, before they become habitual responses or common responses or common, practices that we engage in. Make a decision as to we want to continue or we want to start something new. So how do we want the effect of that stimuli to be projected in future scenarios? The law of readiness, according to Thorndike, is basically a series of responses that can go together, and they all make up a chain to reach a goal. And the importance of finding a connection between different responses is that if you find a connection between the way you, for example, completed an assignment or completed a task in the past and it was successful, then you would draw a connection between that particular task or that particular project you did, let's say, and something that's currently on your plate. And you want to make a connection between those two things so that the result will be similar, positive than the previous one. And of course, the law of exercise. This is, as a parent, we see this every day in our children. Connections become strengthened with practice, and weakness when a practice is discontinued. So the more we do things, the more we get a handle of it, the better we are at it. In this idea of connectionism, and I'm only briefly going to talk about Gestalt, because Gestalt is it's a complex theory, and it's used presently in instructional design and graphics and digital, and creating digital media. So any of you that are technology gurus or part of your professional or personal endeavors involves technology, Gestalt would be a good guideline to follow. For example, if you're designing a website or you're designing a document or you're designing even a lesson, something you want to talk about. So a couple of the basic keys of Gestalt would be figure/ground. So this principle kind of shows our perpetual tendency to separate whole figures from their backgrounds. So, you're looking at a particular figure, you're looking at let's say a picture of a tree compared to, where that tree sits. So the ability to distinguish the tree from its environment, and the ability to, I guess, recognize that tree despite of the background and where it is found in a picture, in a drawing, in a painting, when you're driving a car, out the window, that sort of thing. Similarity. So Gestalt theory states that things which are visual characteristics, such as a shape or color or the way things feel, texture, is seen as belonging together in the viewer's mind. So to create a group of things based on their physical characteristics. Gestalt law of proximity holds that objects or shapes that are close to one another appear to form in groups. So again, a lot of these theories, when we talk about them without actually applying them to a situation, it's kind of abstract. So I really invite you to, maybe do a quick search online and get an example of, a lesson using Gestalt, or I guess maybe something that will kind of put it into context. But essentially, the principles are used not only in presenting visual information, but also in interpreting a reality. So with Gestalt's theory of proximity, we automatically assume, and I know it's a horrible word, but we automatically assume that things that are close together or that are, geographically in a similar situation are in the form of a group. So we automatically assume that things are groups based on how close they are to each other. Closure, the principle of closure in Gestalt is basically the satisfaction of a pattern encoded as it were into a brain, thus triggering recognition and stimulus. So basically, it involves the brain's provision of missing details thought to be part of a potential pattern. So when you see something that doesn't seem to be complete or follow logically, our minds tend to fill in that gap in order to complete that pattern or make that pattern closed. And so, as we say, we see a movie to achieve closure. We want to see that happy ending type of thing. The Gestalt principle of continuity, it tends to assume that shapes go beyond their endpoint. So for example, if you're looking at a painting of a specific part of, let's say, a forest, your mind automatically assumes that that forest, that those trees, that greenery expands beyond what you're looking at in the picture or in the painting or in that frame. So it goes beyond that two-dimensional picture or frame we're looking at with our eyes and processing with our minds. And then finally, the principle of symmetry or the principle of order, which states that you shouldn't be given, the learner shouldn't be given the impression that something is out of balance. You want to always present, if you're giving two examples of things, keep giving two examples. If you're let's take it to the design perspective. If you're designing a web page and you're using two spaces after a colon, you want to use that, and you want to consistently use that pattern throughout whatever it is that you're designing. If an object is asymmetrical or doesn't seem to match, let's say, a pattern, the viewer might be disenchanted with it or might want to disengage with it instead of focusing on what the actual example is, content. Same as when we're delivering a class or a lecture, we want to make sure that our examples, that the way we teach is consistent, that it's balanced, that if we give the students an example for, a specific math problem, that we continue to give examples for that math problem, where the students will focus on, like, why didn't you do an example? She does an example for everything else. And then in the meantime, they lose the value of the lesson. I'm going to get into a couple of the teaching theories. Guthrie teaching theory or contiguity theory basically proposes that learning is a consequence of association between particular stimulus, so things that excite us or interest us, and our responses to those, and how stimuli and responses affect specifically sensory motor patterns. So our instinctual behavior or instinctual reaction to things. For example, when we're driving, we tend to hit our brakes whenever we see, upcoming traffic, for example, even if we don't necessarily have to brake yet. So we already know what's going to happen in the next, 10 seconds. So we go ahead and, unconsciously sometimes just put our, foot on that pedal. And then, Guthrie also, within that association between particular stimulus or particular situations and our responses to those particular situations, is the ability for us to do things. So the ability for us to physically do things or behave in a certain way in order for conditioning to occur. So in order for us to, for example, a safe driver is a driver that's aware. It's a driver that doesn't want to hit somebody from behind. So we see that, forward traffic, and we try to avoid, because we're conditioned to, we're safe drivers, we don't have a car accident. So that's our conditioning. And then since learning involves conditioning of special movements, instruction must be present in very specific tasks. So if we need to react in a different way to a specific situation that we're used to reacting to, then we need to be taught or given instruction to how to modify that behavior. And again, exposure to many variations and stimulus patterns is desirable in order to produce a generalized response. So if you'd like to react differently to different situations, I'm keeping this traffic example going, then we need to, let's see, how long it takes us to brake if the traffic jam is a mile ahead, or how about if it's raining, or how about if it's snowing, or how about if, we need to replace our brakes. So all of those variations to the stimulus and how things are going to happen. Traffic is different in rain, as we know. Traffic is different, or driving is different at night. Driving is different, under, with wind. Driving is different. So the stimuli that we see, in our car when we drive, the more we get used to different types of situations, the more we're able to adapt to those situations. So, for example, in doing this, we discover, by using varying situations to come up with a get standard for our response to those things, we try to, pick the best scenario out of all of them. And that's the one that we want to stick to. Now we're jumping to B.F. Skinner. I think most of us know who Skinner is and his teaching theory. So basically, Skinner argued that there are two major purposes to education. Number one, obviously, to teach students both verbal and nonverbal behavior. Any of you that have been to an undergraduate class in communication, interpersonal communication, you learn about, verbal cues versus nonverbal cues, and all of you are working or teaching, so you're familiar with how to tell if a student is engaged, how an employee is engaged, if they're out of it, if they're, not getting it. So you read their facial expression, you want them to shake their heads up and down to kind of acknowledge that they're understanding what you're saying. And of course, we want to interest our students in learning. And he always recommended bringing students' behavior to kind of controlling or monitoring students' behavior by providing reinforcement only in the presence of a stimuli relevant to the learning task. So for example, if you are doing a class presentation, then you're rewarded or you're given positive feedback while you're doing that presentation, not after the fact. So relevant to the learning task. So the learning task in that case would be learning how to give a presentation or practicing giving a presentation or giving a presentation, and then receiving that knowledge while you're actually presenting. Contingencies of reinforcement. So there are relations which prevail between our behavior and response and consequences. So contingencies of reinforcement are comprised of antecedents. So things that occur or events that occur immediately before you behave in a certain way. Responses are behaviors and consequences. So things that happen immediately after. So what do the, moments or days leading up to an event, how does that impact how we learn and how we present information, and directly after that, how we respond? Will we respond differently if the the days or the moments leading up to that particular moment were happy and smooth, or did we encounter some major issues before that particular moment that will result in us responding to something in a different way? The term contingencies refers to the relationship or interrelationship between these events. So things that happen before and things that happen immediately after an event occurs. So contingencies of reinforcement describe an antecedent behavior consequence link in which the consequence increases the likelihood that behavior will occur again in the presence of an antecedent. So chances are, if the next time you get up to present a presentation in front of your classmates or online or in a video conference, and you have a tumultuous day, you're likely to kind of fall into that same pattern of presenting the material and not being all there. And then the after fact might be like negative feedback or something that you would have done better and would have received altering feedback if you would have had a calm and focused day before, or time before you would arrive at that particular event, which is the presentation. So basically what Skinner is saying, that the before, the during, and the after are intrinsically tied together. So it really puts into perspective how, a series of how time is interrelated, and how our responses to things in the environment really take into account time that has passed and time that will be coming in the future. So So laboratory studies of learning. So we're going to look at Hall and Tolman here. And Hall's systematic behavior theory is basically the development of habits and skills. Um, the idea that they would proceed from the simple to the complex. So you would learn something from the simple, defining a word, to the more complex, which might be analyzing or evaluating in comparison to something else. So in the 1930s, Hall undertook to construct a grand theory, right? And he did. And it was basically to unite all psychology on the concept of homeostasis, which is borrowed from psychology. And I had to look this up myself, but homeostasis is a word that refers to the active regulation of critical biological variables. Okay. So for example, your kidney regulates the salt and water balance in your body, and your pancreas regulates your sugar, right? Your blood sugar. So he believed that we could manipulate, okay, the way that our body reacts to certain things by reducing our salt intake, or decreasing our sugar intake in order to modify the way our body behaves. And he reasoned that these homeostatic mechanisms might provide a scientific explanation for motivation. So it was really fascinating how he tied something that's completely in the physical world to something that we feel or intuit in our minds, such as motivation. So behavior, he regarded behavior as an outward expression of the organisms, in this case, the human brain, in pursuit of biological health. So all the motivation, basically, according to Hall, is coming from our biological needs. So, for example, if we need, if we regard an organism, if we regard something as, positive and helping us, have a better day, okay, then that will translate into us perhaps, eating a healthy lunch. So it's kind of interesting to see the connection. And it's hard to come up with an example on the fly on what exactly his direct connection. You have to really look into his theory in more depth, but that idea that our motivation really stems from our physical well-being. And I'm sure some of you can kind of think about that for a bit and kind of like analyze that idea and see that, it might very well be the truth. Our motivation, we might be more motivated and willing to work on a long project if we are sitting in a comfortable, office environment with, snacks and drinks and state-of-the-art computers, for example. So we're kind of alluding to a Maslow's hierarchy of needs to an extent. Tolman, on the other hand, he believes that the teacher's task is to create stimulus conditions which make it possible for a learner to perceive clearly what leads to what and to understand the different means. So basically, Tolman was one of the leading figures in protecting academic freedom during the 1950s, during the McCarthy era. So he was definitely someone that was humanistic, human rights, civil rights, and just the right of people to express themselves and and be and have their freedom of speech and their freedom to learn and express themselves during a tough era in our history in the United States. And basically, he believed that there were three different variables that influence behavior, and they are independent, intervening, and dependent variables. So basically, if you think of the experimental method, you have the control group, you have the experimental group, and then you have the treatment. So if you look at it this way, you might be able to understand that whole idea of independent, intervening, and dependent variables. So according to his theory, the experimenter can manipulate the independent variables, right? These are the independent variables are the stimuli provided, and in turn influence the intervening variables. So, if you do this, you exercise for an hour versus, 30 minutes, how much hungrier will you be, right? And then the dependent variables is the result of that. So very similar to our basic scientific experimental method. So by looking at learning in this way, right, it really allowed him as a psychologist to measure the strength of intervening variables. So, how particular issues or conditions or circumstances that are happening to a particular group of people are going to have a result or the end result of that. So for example, as a teacher, if I were to give, half of you an hour and a half to write an essay versus 45, the other half of you write a 45, you get 45 minutes to write an essay, the end result would be extremely different. Um, and maybe not, depending on your background. If you're coming in with strong writing skills, strong analytical skills, you may be able to knock that out in 45 minutes. But those of us that need more time for processing and we're stuck in the 45-minute group and not the 2.5 hour, and I'm sorry, 1.5 hour group, the result or the product that we submit, for example, a paper or project, whatever, will be very different based on that treatment. The treatment being, I'm giving one group 45 minutes longer than I'm giving the other group. So getting into human resources development, we're going to talk about Ganji, but we're going to talk about Ganji's 8 conditions of learning from the bottom up. So signal learning would be the most simplistic or lower level, moving away all the way up. So signal learning, stimulus, chaining, verbal association, discrimination learning, concept learning, rule learning, and then problem solving. So let's look at these individually one by one. So signal learning is basically the simplest form of knowledge acquisition. And we also know it by some of our, behavioral psychologists as classical conditioning. You are, as a learner, conditioned to produce a desired involuntary response. So let's say you haven't eaten for an hour and you see, someone next to you having a fresh pizza delivered and you just start salivating, right? You're just like, your stomach starts grumbling. You didn't realize you were that hungry until you saw that. So it would be a response as a result of stimulus that you would not normally produce. For example, like salivation, I just used that example, at the sound of a bell. So you wouldn't salivate if you heard a bell ring in the background. So the way that, we react to things in a very instinctual sort of way. So it starts from our instincts, again, the bottom of the pyramid. Then as we move up to the more complex conditions of learning, stimulus response learning is a voluntary. So we go from involuntary to a voluntary response to learning that may be used in acquiring verbal skills as well as physical movements and etc. So this type of learning happens when the instructor, for example, praises you, gives you good feedback, for deeper thinking or provides constructive criticism. So if you do a project for work and you submit it to your manager and the manager says, hey, this is great. Why don't you look into this? Why don't you add this? Why don't you give me another example of this, this table? So it's when we're able to control our responses more consistently. Then number 3 is chain learning, which occurs when we, the learners, are able to connect 2 or more previously learned things. So again, as we move up, through the different levels of this pyramid, we see that we go from learning a single bit of information or reacting in a very instinctual, non-cognitive way to a particular situation or stimulus to slowly being able to control what we think. And as we move up, you'll see that you'll be able to apply it to other situations, generalize it, critique it, question it, and so on and so forth. So going back to chain learning, more complex psychomotor skills are learned, but they tend to occur naturally. So again, if you're looking at a specific physical task, so tying your shoes. As adults, it's not really difficult anymore, but as a child with my 5-year-old, she has a darn time trying to figure it out. So, she'll get it eventually, but that's the way it goes. But it's more difficult than the initial, pizza salivation situation. Then number 4, verbal association, which occurs when the learner makes associations using verbal communication. So speaking and expressing yourself to someone else. Number 5 is discrimination learning. So this is when we start to develop criteria for that which we learn and information which we are presented from. So discrimination learning is seen when we as learners are able to perform different responses to a series of similar stimuli that might differ in a systematic way. And discrimination learning is made more difficult when the learner comes across something that he or she doesn't really know how to process, or hasn't encountered before, or they encountered it maybe in a different way that really is completely different from what they're experiencing now. So example of that would be, let's say, a patient complaining of abdominal pain after abdominal surgery. So in this case, the student, right, us, you need to learn how to differentiate, surgery pain from gas, for example, intra-abdominal bleeding, incisional pain, or infection, let's say. So that questioning, or that, ability to understand becomes, interfered. It's interfered with, how you see, what the facts you presented with now versus with what you were experienced with. So I've, never had abdominal surgery, but you've had, gastrointestinal issues, and, have gas and severe gas. And sometimes gas could be like, it would feel like somebody's stabbing you in the side with a knife. So, our ability to kind of go through different scenarios to try to figure out the origin of something. Then we move into concept learning, which is where things really get fun, which involves the ability to make consistent, responses to different stimuli. It's the process in which we as learners know how to organize learning in a systematic structure and foster deeper learning. So when we get to the 6th and the 7th levels, we start to connect things and know what certain aspects of a concept or situation we need to examine further to gain a better understanding. So we begin the process of self-evaluation of knowledge acquisition, which is really interesting. So it's basically the student's behavior being controlled by abstract properties. So you must be the one that, kind of looks at something and says, I need to learn this about that in order to gain a deeper understanding. And then rule learning involves being able to learn relationships between two or more concepts and apply them in different situations, whether they're old or new. So you're confronted with the same problem in two completely different situations. While you have a general idea of how to resolve this problem, you still have to maneuver in a way that it lends itself to the situation, and you can apply the information to the situation. So rule learning and problem solving go hand in hand. By the time you realize, okay, this happened, at home, and this happened at work, it's similar, but how do I respond? How do I deal with, the situation? How do we deal with the problem? Because the situation is completely different. And then that leads us to the ability to solve problems, the ability to analyze the same problem in multiple situations and being able to come up with a solution based on, all those factors. Then aside from Ganji's conditions for learning, there's the 9 events of instruction, or conditions of learning. So one is to learning as the student, and then being an instructor. So this would be the 9 levels or 9 events in order to, according to Ganji, of instruction. Okay, so the ability to deliver. So previously those 8 were acquiring and processing, and this is to instruct or teach. Okay, so it goes from the top to the bottom, unlike the pyramid, which was the bottom to the top. So gaining attention would be the first, and informing learners of the objectives, and so on and so forth. So gaining attention, obviously, it's, be taking it to a writing or an essay. It's that interesting fact or interesting statistic at the beginning of your paper, for example, or if you're giving a speech, that clincher, the one that brings people in. Obtain your students' attention. So you're the instructor in this case, so that they will watch and listen while you present the information. So things like icebreakers, current news events, case studies, statistics, something that will gain their attention. So that's number 1. Number 2 is to definitely inform learners of their objectives. And you don't have to be rigid about it. You might want to be able to say to your trainer, beginning of the training program, give them a couple of bullets. This is what we're going to get out of this today. or in the next hour, you'll be, when you finish this in the next hour, you should be able to complete, these 2 tasks. So it allows the students to organize their thoughts and prepare themselves what they're about to see or do or hear. So again, learning objectives in education, but you can also have instructions or activities or present, sample work, previous that someone previously or previous training, workshop yielded or something like that. Number 3 is to stimulate recall of prior learning. So make sure that when you're delivering content or you're teaching, that you're also asking students to recall information from a previous course or a previous situation or a previous time in history. Again, trying to make that example applicable to the type of students in your class. I've been going to that, the beginning of when we started our session tonight, that beginning of, finding that common denominator between all your learners so that you're able to create an inclusive learning environment. So again, bringing students in, if there's a prerequisite to your course or if there was an activity or something that happened before, that the group has in common, draw on those types of situations in order for them to be able to pull from different things that they've all experienced in order to better understand what they're about to encounter. Then number 4 is to present the content, obviously. So utilize the different variety. So give a little lectures, some, small group work, maybe put people in pairs, have, a game, for example. So those types of activities. So in face-to-face courses, for example, you might want to use like clickers, or if in our online course, during our online sessions, there is a polling tool in Zoom that I could use and take a poll. How many of you have sat in a class that's super boring? Here's a poll, blah, blah, blah. And so again, engaging the learner in the material and content. Number 5, of course, learning guidance, providing learning guidance. So make sure that your instructions are clear, that students know exactly what they need to do, what the deliverable is going to be. Give them suggestions on how they can complete the task. Don't overburden, as adult learners, and an instructor of adult learners for many years. One thing I realized was that, adult learners, just like regular traditional aged students, some students function well with extremely clear parameters and restrictions and guidelines and a format and a template, and others prefer to be more free-flowing. They're more maybe global abstract thinkers, so they just need a basic idea of what they need to do, and then they can just figure out the specifics. So take that into account too. Take those multiple intelligences, which we'll look at again some more during the rest of this course, in designing training or in designing a lesson, in designing a program. Again, number 6, elicit performance or practice. Make sure that you give students enough time to complete tasks. Don't rush them through. If the nature of the task is something quick, then make sure that they're aware of that they're not going to be penalized. Students are very sensitive about grades and points and just feedback in general, and they don't want to look kind of silly in front of their peers. So, allot the appropriate amount of time for enough practice in a specific skill in order for the deliverable to be not only good for you as the instructor to read. Of course we want to read and watch good videos and read great papers and not have to worry about grammar, but more so for the student to feel a sense of accomplishment upon completing the task or meeting the course expectations. Then, of course, we provide feedback, and that's pretty much self-explanatory. You can take an anonymous survey. You can send people, have people write their comments down on a sheet of paper and fold it up and throw it into a basket, however, you want to function, but always solicit feedback. And then you want to assess with the students. If it's not a formal course where you have a pre and post test situation, for example, or a graded quiz or assignment, there's other types of formative types of assessment, a quick pop quiz, a quick poll, a quick muddy point, for example. Somebody, you've collected muddy points. So basically, what's the one thing about today's lesson you didn't understand? That was from last week. This week you covered, ask students, well, how do you feel about this topic? How do you feel about that topic? So it doesn't have to be formal assessments. It could be informal assessments as well. And this will help you as an instructor maybe say, that wasn't a good idea, or maybe I need to change that activity, or maybe the students, I need to change the way I deliver the information because they're not understanding, so on and so forth. And then finally, enhancing our retention and transfer. So allow students to apply information to their own personal contexts, okay? This increases retention because they can relate. Everything that you do for me in this course, I encourage you to use examples from work. I encourage you to, give me real life things that have happened to you versus, making something up or looking at a textbook case study. You are a case study. You have experience and you're able to explain things and transfer some of the ideas that we learn about in this class, by sharing your personal stories and experience with the rest of of us, in this class. So that would be an example of transfers of learning. So now we're going to look at Carl Rogers. I know a lot of you have written about Carl Rogers in your assignments and your discussion posts, etc., to me. So Carl Rogers basically wrote a guide for facilitators. And I like the way he used the term facilitators versus instructors or teachers. It removes that idea of authoritarianism, which we'll look at in a couple of slides with some of the other theorists that address authoritarianism specifically. But Carl Rogers' theory of learning included 10 principles and to define the role of the teacher as a facilitator. So we're looking at facilitators as, instead of lecturing in front of a class, I'm going to sit down next to you and look at stuff together as more like a tutor, for example. So in the early 80s, Carl Rogers came up with this guide, and he summarized this role by stating that the primary task of the teacher is to permit the student to learn, to feed his or her own curiosity. And his 10 principles of facilitation are complementary to his 10 principles of learning. So together, in this case it's 10, and we've condensed it to 8 in this particular, for the sake of this class, the pyramid. We look at, facilitation as a more conducive way of instructing learners on, how to complete a project or how to process information, etc. So together, the facilitators and learners form a human learning theory that really emphasizes how the learner perceives, how the learner processes information, how they interpret the information, how they deliver or explain that information afterwards. So number one, the facilitator has much to do with setting the initial mood or climate in the course, group or class experience. If his own basic philosophy is the one of trust of the group and the individuals who compose the group, then its point of view will be communicated in many subtle ways. So convey a philosophy of trust, similar to what we did in our class here. Very first in my announcement, I made sure to let you guys know this was an open environment, inclusive. I invite controversy, I invite, feedback, all with respect and openness and understanding to each of our, peers and colleagues in the class, given their specific, feelings and beliefs and backgrounds. The facilitator helps to elicit and clarify the purpose of the individuals in the class as well as the more general purposes of the group. So there are specific purposes for individual learners, and then there's a group purpose. And it's important to distinguish that. And he relies upon the desire of each student, the facilitator relies upon the desire of each student to implement those purposes which have meaning for him or her, such as, as the motivational force behind significant learning. So once you personalize the education, people are motivated to learn. The facilitator endeavors to organize and make easy available the widest possible range of resources for learning. So, I add optional resources, I add videos, I send stuff to you guys, through announcements. So I'm building that repository of knowledge for you guys to pick and choose what you like best. He regards himself as a flexible resource to be utilized by the group. So the facilitator is a resource versus a bank that is full of knowledge, a knowledge bank full of knowledge, and you withdraw certain pieces of knowledge when you need it. That's one way of looking at it, but you want to give students as much, as many ways as possible to get that knowledge out of that bank as possible. The facilitator regards him or herself as a flexible resource to be utilized by a group. So you want people to not only tap into your knowledge and your experience individually, but as a group as well. And in responding to expressions in the classroom group, the facilitator accepts both the intellectual content and the emotionalized attitude, so how way people feel and interpret things, endeavoring to give each aspect the approximate degree of emphasis. So you want to treat actual facts with feelings in the same way. Okay, you want to respect both. And then finally, in the last four, as an accepted classroom climate becomes established. So once you establish a rapport with your students, once they know you and you know them, you're able to increasingly become more of a participant learner. So again, that whole idea of, instead of standing in front of you, I'm either sitting next to you or sitting in a circle and you're around me, for example, as the instructor. And you invite the members of the group to be a part of the knowledge base as well. You take initiative in sharing information about yourself, your feelings, and be a human being to your group. You are perceiving people that have strong feelings or strong emotions to certain things, and you empathize with them, and you redirect the conversation when needed. And of course, as a facilitator, we as leaders, we as leaders recognize and accept our own limitations. So there's just stuff that, that I've had to, teach you or kind of review for you in this course, that I've had to go back and kind of refresh my memory and say, oh, I've never, I remember that. Let me refresh my memory. So, and then sometimes I just, I just have to say, I just don't know, let me find out for you. So again, when you admit that you need more information or you just don't know, that brings that humanity back to your students. WATS's guidelines for learning facilitation is kind of like a bullet point of just points to remember, kind of not best practices necessarily, but some of them could be considered best practices. A lot of them, are common sense, in the same, in the way that, if without, giving people feedback or rewards, they're not going to perform as well. So a lot of these are common sense, but they're helpful anyways. So obviously, if you reward people, you give them feedback, even if their information or their answer is incorrect, they will continue to share information with you. Threat and punishment commonly produce avoidance behavior. So if you penalize people for turning in work late, they may not turn work in late again, but some of them may, have a situation that they can't avoid, and they it's hard for them to get the work in on time for whatever reason on that particular deadline, and then they avoid doing the work altogether. So that's those are two sides to the same coin kind of thing. How ready are we to learn something new is contingent about factors such as, for example, experience. We can learn only in relation to what we already know. So again, I've quoted Plato before, knowledge is recollection. Some of you may actually agree or disagree with that. I think we can learn new information that we don't know, but it's a lot more difficult because we need to create a context for that. We learn new information, accept new information when it's relevant to us. And of course, when we are encouraged to, pursue our studies, pursue the information. If there's something that we did wrong, there's no threats to our physical or emotional or intellectual well-being. We're not going to be punished. We're not going to be penalized. It's going to be a teachable moment for us as facilitators. And it's going to be a moment where we say, you know what, let's take a minute. Most of you didn't understand this concept. Let's go ahead and review it all together. And, not just, I guess, single out those individuals that didn't get it, or whatever, they could have done a better job. Just address it as a group. Again, the organization of content in a course, or having students plan themselves how they want to complete a project or a deliverable. And again, the ability to participate, it increases motivation and flexibility in the rate of learning. So students are not worried about deadlines necessarily, or, having the perfect APA style, or, this or that, and they can focus on the idea or the gist or the content of the project. Then it would, we would all be better off. We'd get better work. They would get better, they would produce better work. We would receive better work and positive results. Autocratic, meaning the teacher as authoritarian figure. That's obviously a negative by today's standards. If we're student-centered or learner-centered, we want students to respect us, but not defy us, or kind of like go behind our backs, or, just see us as purely authoritarian. In the preceding bullet, closed authoritarian environments, characteristic of most conventional schools, condemn most learners to continuing criticism, sarcasm, or discouragement or failure. Unfortunately, we see this a lot in lower level, like I'm saying, like primary education, where, you know, I guess it's a right and wrong method. Teachers call on a student to answer questions. Student doesn't get it right. Their point is taken away. So it's a very punitive kind of system that we have, oftentimes in our primary schools. I think when you reach secondary school, middle school, high school, students are a little bit more free thinkers, and they're going to, I guess, not strike back, but kind of like, question the professor's motivation for being a certain way, or speaking in a certain way, or, giving that negative feedback. So we have more abilities for a discourse. And then finally, an open, non-authoritarian atmosphere is conducive to learner initiative, creativity, encouragement. So all of the positives that we want in a learning environment. Whole we've seen before. So his 7 assumptions, we'll go through these quickly. Any learning episode occurs in a specific situation is profoundly influenced by that fact. So teaching a specific concept, for example, in, let's say you're the learner and you learn about, I don't know, humanitarian psychology, right? And we talk about the humanitarian psychology and everything we talked about, let's say, up to this point of the class. And we find ourselves in a situation where we're going through some major personal, turmoil, or we're stuck, or we just don't see a way out. We take that knowledge and that learning moment in a different way than if we were taking that same class or learning that same material during a time in our lives when, everything was great and, there were no issues in our lives. So the specific situation is really connected. The way we process the information is really based on situational factors, as well as, what type of learning is taking place. Perhaps some of the concepts that we learn about in this class that talk about, openness, humanity, community, maybe those theories at that moment in your life when you're having a tough time, you can apply them in a different way. So again, it's based on situation, and we see that before. Adult learning is situational. Analysis and planning of educational activities should be based on realities of human experience. So use real life examples. Education is practical. We have to learn about theories and abstract things, but it's always important to actually interpret it in a real fashion. Try to give the learners an application of the theory. I try to do that when I lecture and when I give examples, and I try to be kind of succinct, because, you can definitely ramble, but, always try to bring it down to earth. Always try to explain things to people in a simple way that gets to the point, and make sure that they understand that. The planning or analysis of an educational activity is usually undertaken in terms of some period that the mind abstracts for analytical purposes from the complicated reality. So again, we are human beings. There are some things that we talk about or we learn about in a class or in a training seminar or at work in a situation that we analyze in a different way, depending on how we see it. Okay, so that's important. So planning or analysis of educational activity should be undertaken, should be developed by the educator and the learner, and then maybe someone outside. So if you're designing a new lesson or a new training program, you want to develop it. You want to get some feedback from possible trainees or possible, co-workers. And then you want to get somebody that's maybe from the training department that has a specialization in training and development, just to get a holistic perspective on that educational activity. And then, of course, any design of education can be understood as a complex interacting elements, not as a sequence. So we can't see learning as something that's linear versus something that's like circular or organic. And of course, John Dewey. We've looked at John Dewey in the past, of his holistic psychology, philosophy. I use those interchangeably sometimes because they go hand in hand often. So again, Dewey's concept of experience allows his holistic approach to education in the sense that it's based on the interactions between human being and the world. It takes all sides of human existence, its being in the world, as a methodological point of departure. So experience is really the central aspect of learning, especially for the adult learner. Democracy, participatory democracy. So his theory on democracy is that that the belief that democracy, and I'm not just talking about political democracy, I'm talking about a system of a way of thinking, a way of living in a democratic system where people have free choice and people have participation in decisions made, et cetera, et cetera. He sees that as an ethical ideal that calls upon people to build communities. So democracy is necessary to build communities. Which is necessary opportunities and resources that are available for every individual to realize his or her particular capacities. So in a true democracy, we are all given the opportunity to shine in our own way and to function in that society using our best, strengths. In other words, our strengths. And this kind of ties into his naturalistic, philosophy or psychology, naturalistic logic, which underlies his work. And as an educational theorist, his account of democracy is basically a continual process of social inquiry that emphasizes the importance of discussion and debate as a mechanism of decision making. So he invites dissenting opinions, differing opinions in that part of the learning process, in that part of the community building process. Dewey's idea of continuity, basically defined as, sound. He believed that the continuity happened when there was sound educational experience involved both continuity and interaction between the learner and what is learned. In Dewey's philosophy, that is basically that experience rises from interaction of two principles. Dewey's principle of continuity states that all experiences, all we go through in the past and all we going through now, are carried forward and influence future expectancies. And experiences. So that's very much how we live life, I think. Our past influences our future. And that's not always a positive thing. Sometimes we need a clean break. But for the most part, that's what continuity means. Which leads us to interaction and continuity, which is the intersection between experience and education, which is a major part of his discourse, his philosophical discourse. He believed that interaction and education always determine the quality of the experience for lifelong learning. And I think this is what we begin to see. Dewey's assertion that a student's experience is the result of interaction between the student and his and her environment. And that's where we get that idea of, by today, modern standards, what we call lifelong learning, which is learning beyond the classroom, learning beyond the training workshop, the webinar. So that sort of learning. And we talk about Alfred Bandura. He was the father of organizational psychology for all intents and purposes. He was one of the first to coin the term social psychology or social learning theory. So not social psychology, social learning theory, which he believed were an important source for learning new behaviors and for achieving behavioral change in institutionalized settings. So Bandura was really the one that started the idea of how the parts of the whole, of the organization or institution work together and serve as a community and support mechanism for, the employees or the members of that community. And he believed that there were three regulatory systems that control behavior. That means the antecedent inducements greatly influence the time and responsive behavior. So the ability for us to take our previous behavior and knowledge and respond to certain things within the organization, certain situations or change factors within the organization. Again, that whole emphasis on feedback and the importance of the way we intuit and we interpret social situations and learn from those situations. Social cognitive theory focuses on how behavior and growth are affected by the cognitive operations that occur during social activities. So in his philosophy or psychology, everything we do, no matter where we're at, is part of learning. So whether we're sitting in an office working with a colleague, or whether we're sitting at a bar talking with a friend, it's all learning, because we are constantly processing information and interpreting information, analyzing information. And then the key theoretical components of the social cognitive theory that are applied in Bandura's idea of education are self-efficacy, self-regulation, observational learning, and reciprocal determinism. So, of course, self-efficacy, according to Bandura, is a concept of personal judgment of how well we can execute courses of action required to deal with prospective situations. So how we can maybe forecast the potential issue and find the resources ourselves to resolve those issues. So expectations of self-efficacy determine whether an individual will be able to exhibit coping behavior and how long effort will be sustained in the face of obstacles. Okay, so ability to, again, that problem-solving ability. Self-regulated learning is one of the domains of self-regulation, and it is aligned most closely with educational aims. So basically, it refers to learning that is guided by metacognition. And metacognition is a great term. It was very popular in the 1980s and 90s. And it's thinking about thinking. And a lot of what we do in this class and a lot of what we're studying in this particular course is thinking about thinking. And I think when you hit the master's and doctoral level in education, obviously you're involved with more theory. So you're constantly, evaluating and analyzing the thought process and how you yourself process information. So, thinking about our own thinking, strategic action, planning, monitoring, and evaluating our personal progress towards a specific standard. And of course, our motivation to learn. So self-regulated really describes a process of taking control and evaluating our own behavior and modifying that behavior. So observational learning is basically learning that occurs through seeing things or being in a classroom or in an environment. And it's a research method. Action research uses observational learning. And what's beautiful about observational learning is that you are not involved at all. All you're doing is being a sponge at the back of the room in a corner, taking it all in. And once we take it all in, we reflect on that, which, alludes to some of the reflective types of psychology and or educational theory we've looked at. And we reflect and then we interpret. So we don't necessarily process information as we receive it. We try to suspend judgment and evaluation while we're conducting the observation, and then quietly afterwards reflect on it and we learn. And we come up with, ideas or solutions or theories, that we want to focus on our research. Reciprocal determinism is basically the theory set forth by Bandura, which states that a person's behavior influences not only himself or herself, but also the social environment. So he accepts the possibility that an individual's behavior may be conditioned through a series of sequence of consequences. At the same time, he asserts that a person's behavior and personal factors such as cognitive skills or attitudes can impact the environment. And I think we know that from something as, as troubling and but as unfortunately as common as domestic violence. We're a victim of domestic violence. Our behavior at work, maybe we're withdrawn, maybe we become aggressive or mad at our coworkers because we're being mistreated at home. So again, the way we accept the way we are experiencing a situation and the way that we are conditioned to behave has a great effect on our surroundings in our environment. This is a chart that's in both our textbook as well as the PowerPoint presentation in the module this week. And it's a nice little chart. I actually printed it out and I have it in my office of the intersection between performance at the individual, organizational, and of course our process, basically what our job description is, and the performance variables. How well are we meeting the goals and the mission? How well are we interacting with inputs and processes and outputs and purposes? How our performance is affected by, let's say that the organization is going through major changes, and employees are unmotivated, and there's low employee morale. What do we need to increase that motivation in order to increase our performance level at the organizational and individual levels? And this is also weighed by performance levels and variables. This is how an organization measures their own goals. So if an organization is looking at the performance evaluations for their employees, and they see that, 60% of employees are reporting that they have low self-esteem, or they have low morale, or they don't know, they have no opportunity for advancement, then that is data that the organization can take and then turn around and make it into a learning opportunity or a promotion or some sort of a positive reinforcement for that individual employee. And that, of course, can be remeasured the following fiscal year when the employee goes through the evaluation again, when you can compare and contrast the results of those performance evals. So HRD, performance improvement, is defined as knowledge and expertise required to figure out the present and the future development of an organization, and ways to correct them. And insofar as adult learning, it's critical to maintain performance of an existing system and improve system performance. So it's good to maintain consistency so people feel comfortable and they know what to expect. And when change is going to happen, it's good to prepare people for that change, either through training or through meetings or one-on-one chats with, group chats or whatever the case is, in that particular organization and what that organizational culture has adopted. And then the focus of us as human resource development folks is to intervene when we see something that's not kosher. So we intervene when we see something that the organization goals and the individual personal goals or performance goals for the year are not aligning, for example. So it really takes into account these this connection between the organization and the individual. Another graph that's in our book, adult learners controlling their learning and planning processes. So here, adult learning is defined as a process of adults gaining knowledge and expertise. And the idea is that, number one, learners universally want to have more control over the learning process. Of course, I think we all agree with that. And of course, number two, that learning increases as a result, coming from adult education and adult learning theory, which takes the situation and your personal expertise into account. So when we look at this figure, it really provides the framework for the 4 phases of adult learning planning and process in an organization, any professional organization. So the phases are the need, right? Need to determine what learning is required, maybe doing a SWOT analysis or looking at a goal assessment, creating a strategy to create resources to help people achieve those learning goals or institutional goals that we need our employees to meet. The need to implement the learning strategy and use the learning resources, and of course, evaluate that learning strategy. So that whole idea of, maybe if you think of it like a pilot, all right, so we need to increase performance in this area. Let's take these 5 employees, put them through this training, see how they do, and then evaluate their performance, and then maybe tweak it or change things up, or maybe it worked fine, and then apply it to a larger population. So these 4 phases serve as categories or lenses used to search for what is known about learners controlling their own learning process. So again, it gives adult learners control over what types of information and how they learn and how they apply it to the overall institutional goals and mission. So that concludes the major points for our Module 3 content. For Module 4, we're going to look at types of learning, such as self-directed, experimental, or learner experience research. We're going to look at a couple of theorists, Garrison, Kolb. We're going to look at motivation and learning in general, get in more detail in that. Of course, differences in adult learners, our cognitive controls, and controls in learning. And we're going to look a little bit more into lifespan learning and how that applies to us as adult learners. I thank you for your time, and I look forward to our next meeting in Module 4.